We had this case with the husband and the secretary, and we had your case where the wife was refusing to accept the get because the husband had an affair with the secretary. And the husband said, look, I'm sorry. I feel bad that it happened this way, but now I love her. What we told her was, you've got to move on and you have to accept the get. She refused to accept the get, and so we helped him deposit the get.
What rights do you have as a married couple? What rights or,
you don't have any rights. Yeah, I was going to say, Judaism doesn't have rights.
In Judaism, you're allowed to fall out of love, to move on. And that's not going to change the basic fact of Tovat Hayeled, what's best for the kid. And what's best for the kid is if it's safe and good.
It's important for people to know that that's not like, oh, it doesn't happen in the Jewish community, or like, oh, it's super crazy rare. This stuff happens in our community. So when we're talking about Agunot, like, it's not like so far off, it's so different. People are really, really hurting and hurting each other.
You're listening to the Let's Get Serious podcast, the relationship podcast for frum men. Single, married, separated, divorced, there's something here for the whole chevra. Here's your host, Natan Gettysburg.
Thank you so much for joining us. We got really special guests today. We got the leaders of the International Beit Din, which we'll hear more about. I'm really grateful, really excited for this conversation. I think it'll be really, really interesting. I'll turn to you, Rabbanit, Rabbanit Sarna, Rabbi Dolinger. Am I pronouncing it right?
Sure, Dolinger, but Dolinger is close enough.
Okay. I'll turn to one of you. I guess I'll start with you, Rabbi. If you could just start us off, just giving a little background about what the International Beit Din is and what you do.
Absolutely. And thank you so much for having us on the show today. Thank you to your listeners for taking the time to listen. So basically, the International Beit Din was formed a little more than 10 years ago. Rabbi Simcha Kraus, a well-respected rabbi who many in the audience may have learned with, was the first Av Beit Din. One of my Rebbeim in YU, Rabbi Yosef Blau, was one of the early Dayanim. And basically, what we were seeking to do is to use the Beis Din, to use the rabbinic court, and all the tools in traditional halacha in order to help women and men. It's mostly women, but it's not. We help men as well in significant numbers also. When divorce was not forthcoming, I guess I would say that in recent years, it's shifted a little bit, and in different ways. The most important thing I guess I'd want to convey is that our shift has been in understanding that usually if there's end of marriage problems that result in get extortion or refusal to give, or in more rare cases, refusal to accept, that's almost never the start of the problems. There are cases where we're able to quickly resolve things through conversations and where a lack of effort or care was given earlier, but almost always there was kind of severe coercive control. Now we're seeing the cases, right, that others couldn't resolve often, but there was, pretty unambiguous domestic abuse in those cases, and so that's reframed we've reframed our mission statement and reframed what we do, right? If someone has experienced domestic abuse during their marriage, let's just pause it for a moment that everyone would agree that the thing we're looking at is domestic abuse, because in the cases we see, it's not in the gray usually. Then the get refusal or demands on the get look a lot different if a person has been beaten, say, for years, right? That looks different for that person. What they experience is different. The monetary demand comes off in a different context, and interventions are different. I would say, and I think this may be a surprise to some, we have a close fealty to halacha. Halacha is like our master here, and there are a lot of practices in the world of Beis Din, and I'm excited to talk about them today. And I know we're both excited to get into the weeds a little bit. There are a lot of practices that don't have a ton of basis. It's a little bit like the Wild West out there, and we're pretty excited to try and hear very closely to halacha with the guidance of a team of Rabbanim, Dayanim, and Poskim who we consult with very actively. Final thing I'll say is that education is a core component of our Beit Din. We are teaching Beit Din, maybe a teaching hospital is the way to think about it. It's part of why we're so excited to come on this show and others like it. a lot of what happens and a lot of the problems are preventable. We feel that miseducation, misinformation, and confusion is rampant in this field. I'm curious to your thoughts as well. And so for us, getting the word out about what the halacha is, what the halacha isn't, what the debates are, if there are debates, just making it clear for people what is actually going on is kind of core to our mission and how we view resolution of these cases in Jewish divorce.
Okay, so International Beit Din has nothing to do with the UN or anything like that. It's not international.
Can you imagine the UN, like we have The Hague and we have a Beit Din?
So we Joseph Weiler, one of our co-founders, is involved in international law, but we do operate in countries around the world: England, France, Morocco, Mexico, Canada, the US, Australia, more rarely Israel, only in that the Rabbanit functions there, and there's a state system of divorce. And we actually feel the system, individual actors, and the system is on the whole one of the better and more well-developed Jewish law systems there's been.
But we partner with the Rabbanit. So when we have cases that touch in Israel, we partner with the Rabbanit in those cases.
Right, but usually if it's just pure Israelis, that's not, so it's kind of a funny thing, but the International Beit Din handles cases throughout the diaspora and for many Israelis that are all over the world, traveling, gallivanting the world as they do. But but basically we're everywhere else. Mexico, Canada, and the US are our biggest geographic regions where cases come from.
So you are kind of like the UN because you're boycotting just Israel, but you're everywhere else.
Our Dayanim are in Israel.
I'm sorry. Okay.
Our senior staff are in Israel. Yeah, we support the Israeli economy through our salaries.
Right. Okay, so I want to, as you mentioned, I want to get a little bit into detail as much as possible, like with some questions, especially since my audience is mostly from Orthodox men, and there are issues from that perspective that when I heard Rabbanit Sarna on the Francisca's podcast, it was very wide ranging and there wasn't really much time for detail. So a lot of questions popped up that I'm really grateful that you guys are here to explain. So I think a good way to start off, and I'll turn to you, Rabbanit, is I'll start with a broad question. And my question would be, if you could remake the divorce laws, and as Rabbi Dolinger explained, that seems like a main focus of the Beit Din. So, and there are problems with it, the problems with the divorce laws that I gather. What would you do? You have a clean slate, you are the benevolent dictator, and you're aware of all the problems that happen that you see coming through your doors. What would you change if you were writing the laws from scratch?
Sorry, one second. Clarifying question. American laws or halacha? What are you asking?
You started a new country. There's no laws about anything. You are making the laws about how marriage works, and you can write the laws. It's halacha, it's civil law. It's like Israel, I guess. It's one court.
Interesting. I never thought about this question before. Well, I think, in an ideal world, let's say we're only talking about Jews getting divorced because it's easier than having to imagine a pluralistic society with Jews and other people also. I think, an ideal way, if a marriage is gonna end, and in a perfectly perfect world, no marriages would end, right? But in an unideal world where marriages end and it becomes clear that a marriage is over, a couple would enter mediation, and they would first give a get, and then there would be and receive a get, and then they would kind of very amicably and peaceably divide up their assets, come up with a custody agreement, and move on with their lives. I think that's a very one of the biggest issues in divorce is it can drag on for years. It can get so expensive. It can make things really, really hard for the kids. What if we could envision a world, and again, this isn't exactly the laws, I'm envisioning, a whole culture and a whole way of how humans are. But in a perfect world where the slight imperfection is that marriages sometimes end, I think that's kind of the perfect way that it would go, and the kids would feel loved and supported by both parents throughout, and the parents would feel, loved and supported by their communities, and everything would happen kind of amicably and justly.
I just want to clarify, and I think that's a great answer, that I'm not here to say, I'll be very explicit about it, that there's some great problem, not here to say, I'm not saying there's some great problem with halakha. I actually don't think that's, we deal with agunot, right? That's our jam. And the problem, a lot of activists in this space might say that the problem is halakha. That's been the focus of a lot of writing and commentary. And that is not, to me, the primary problem. And that's not our experience of the primary problem. Halakha, it may not be perfect. And if I were going to write it from scratch, I don't know. I don't have the audacity God wrote the Torah, and and the system has developed via the rabbis and historical interplay with the rabbinic rulings. And so I'm cool with that. I'm a rabbi. I'm down with the halakhic system. I'm proud to defend it. What I will say is that there are certain shitot, main rulings in halakha, that often are ignored or not well understood. And so it's more like there's a specific take about how halakha should go, particularly as it relates to obligating the get. I think the thing that people don't know is that, there are obligations to give and accept the get under various circumstances. And often the get is conceived of as a kind of bargaining chip or a right to kind of interplay in negotiation. And high conflict divorces can get messy. And there are legitimate, real, and contentious fights about who gets what and who is a bad actor and who is a safe parent and who is not. Those are real disputes. And often the get gets mixed up in those disputes such that a religious obligation and a mitzvah from the Torah to give a get when there's a divorce and the kind of parallel rabbinic injunction for women to accept the get, those things get mixed up in, sometimes just and sometimes good faith and sometimes bad faith negotiations. And that for me is the thing. That's the thing, is the get shouldn't be mixed up in the negotiation, whether the negotiation is based on a just claim, an unjust claim, or a blurry claim that's debatable. Either way, the get should just be given. I think I think the law says that already. I think that's the consensus of the halakha. And so I wouldn't change. I'll just say anything really. I'll say one more thing if it's okay. I was a little late getting here, and that's because I was on the phone with a client, and our client was saying how actually Beit Din has been really refreshing, flaws and all, compared to a civil court in their state, family court. Because family courts, as I'm sure you and maybe many of your listeners know or have experience with, can be a total mess often. And not always, but the family court system is, so when thinking about redesigning a law system from scratch, the American system is a fairly messy system. And in particular, the cost, stress, time it takes, it incentivizes dispute and deepening of conflict. And
the idea that you can use the legal system to like torture your ex, it's horrible.
Yeah, so I think the American system brings out not the better angels of people more. And so, I think that's an important part of the message. Beit Din can be an important part of the solution.
Very interesting. I think you're very right about that. I think a lot of people, anybody who's been through the American court system is aware of how it can be misused. I mean, there's things like lawfare and stuff like that in the general world and the corporate world. I feel like there was some open ends in the question. Like, I do want to get a basic idea of just a general idea of what you think the divorce process should be like. If you could write it from scratch, that is not, it's not going to go amicably every time. Like we have entire Masechtot of Gemara, which deal with disputes. Two people come in holding an object and they're arguing about it. So there's rules about it. So, it's not going to be amicable. What do you think should happen? Two people are getting divorced. It's not going to be amicable. What would you say the rules would be? The children should be here or there. The money should be here or there. Was there cheating involved? Should that affect it? I would really appreciate like a thought process here about how it should work. Because you did say like that the get should be given, but that's just like the finalization act. But like, what should be the process that would, resolve the issue? Because as I say, like giving a get just means finalizing the divorce. It doesn't really solve all the problems.
You're absolutely right. And actually, I'm sure Rabbanit Sarna has thoughts about this. What I would say is the following. I think, like Rabbanit Sarna said, mediation. We're often advising folks, if it's not a dangerous situation, sometimes it's dangerous for people and mediation is not appropriate. But if it's not, we're huge promoters of mediation. Often we get referrals from folks who are fighting in court. We say, you don't have to do this. We know a Beis Din that has a great and a lot of Beit Din, by the way, have mediators on staff who are sometimes rabbis, so they'll be aware of cultural sensitivities, but they're trained in mediation. And so even in somewhat conflicting divorces, mediation can be a very effective, cheaper, and more importantly, relatively amicable tool to settle a dispute. People leave not hating each other worse from the situation, but able to move forward. If that won't work, for me, I think Beit Din arbitration, that's the halakhic way to go to a Beit Din. If the Beit Din is properly versed and can handle it, not all Beit Din are really able to handle asset division or custody properly, but to go to a Beit Din, not in a fictitious world, but in the Jewish world we live in, to go to a Beit Din that will enforce the economic rules that match the way in which the couple ordered their lives. So one of the big differences in the Beis Din world is some Beit Din, and this is the normative view in Israel amongst almost all the Rabbanit courts and many of the Haredi courts, is private Haredi Beit Din, and in some major American courts, centrist and Haredi, that equitable distribution or community property, however the assets are divided in the state, that's the minhag of how assets should be divided in the divorce. So in my ideal world, a Beis Din is not looking at property from the Talmudic regime of Nechse Malug and that kind of thing, because that's not how people order their economic affairs in modern society, by and large. Could there be a very insular community? I suppose. But the vast majority of people, even in very Haredi communities, order their economic affairs as what poskim in Israel call an economic partnership. And so if people live in some version of economic partnership, and I know different households have different agreements, tacit or explicit, about what that partnership looks like, that the property should be divided more or less in an equitable manner. There are variations in different theories about what's the most equitable, but an equitable manner based on a variety of factors: who worked, who cared for the kids, who has more money, who needs more money. Fault can be a slight factor in there, in the courts. It's not, there's still bookends on how extreme veering off of equity is going to get. But I think for that and for custody, the best interest of the children is the gold standard in this area. And I think that's
and that's
correct.
The gold standard going back to the Rishonim. Custody, it's not like some new Kiddush, in Israel, they believe in equitable distribution, whatever, right? Like the Rashba and the Ritva write about making custody decisions based on the best interests of the children.
Right, Tovat Hayeled. And, I think it is important, a lot of halakhic sources note that parents have a right to take a child away from a parent fully absent danger. Now, sometimes there really is danger, and that's important. And we see that in our cases sometimes. I don't want to downplay that, but speaking writ large, right, we see extreme cases because that's what that's what our shop is set up to do. But taking parents away from children is akin to kidnapping in many of the halakhic sources. It's on either side. And so that's important to note also, that it has to be in the best interest of the children. And
like Menashe Klein, writes, like taking children away from their parents. Who Isur Torah ligzol me'adam banav. He describes it as an Isur Torah to take children away from their parents.
Wow. So that's an important, to accommodate parental rights to be involved in their children for the benefit of the parents and the children. Parents are people too, though. But the test ultimately has to be in the best interest of the children, especially when there's possible danger, right? That's the big asterisks.
Right. So I have a bunch of questions there. Well, let me go work back to front. So you mentioned the best interest of the children. So that's obviously a vague term, and family courts play with that a lot because there's no actual legal definition. It's really just subjective. But so from a Beit Din perspective, I'll start with this. So a couple or one member of a couple wants to get divorced. You know what? Actually, I want to just go back before that because you mentioned that extreme cases. I'd rather talk about the general case. Do you have experience with like non-extreme cases where there's not like violent abuse? So in those cases, because those are, I think, the vast majority, and it's just a husband and wife, and one of them decides they want to get divorced. What do you think, or what's your approach to what should happen with the children there? Because the other parent is a loving parent, and they're not dangerous or anything, and they love raising their child or their children. So what does the other parent get to say, if anything, about the fact that they're going to lose their child for at least 50% of the time? And if they're the father, it's generally much more than that. So what does the father get to say about this?
Or sorry, I have a question about your case. Is this a case where they don't want to get divorced, or the father just wants full custody?
I'm just saying, let's say a hypothetical case, the wife wants to get divorced, and that's all we know about this case so far. She comes before you and says, I would like to get divorced. My husband, he doesn't.
Got it.
Or
Okay, that's
or
an
maybe,
important element that the
well,
husband doesn't.
I'd rather just give you even a cleaner slate and say that's where it starts. That's where you begin. What happens next?
I mean, a wife comes to a bezdin, the first thing that happens is a husband goes to the husband.
Right. So, and the husband responds, and he shows up, and they both show up before you.
Yes. I think can I just cut to custody? Should we for a moment? I think it's important to distinguish, right? There's legal custody, there's physical custody. And I guess I'm not sure, maybe this is a clarifying question. There are kind of like new creative alternative arrangements, but if
Yeah,
people are
with some
getting
with halachic problems like nesting, there's actually increasingly halachic literature about that offering up like challenges in terms of yichud
do you want
and
to
things
describe
like
what
that.
nesting is?
Well,
Oh, sorry.
Because
So yeah, good question. So nesting would be like the children stay in the family home and the parents, maybe one parent's there with them and the other one's like at an apartment. And then let's say they have like on weeks, mom weeks and dad weeks or whatever it is. And the parents effectively like swap houses during that time. So the kids stay put and the parents are the ones moving.
and we had a case where, actually it was pretty contentious, but we recommended a mediator who we work with, and the mediator suggested they got them actually to a much better place, and it was part of a kind of therapeutic healing for the couple. Not that they stayed together, but at least in the divorce, it was cleaner. And they
And by the way,
came
like
up,
that emotional transformation like carries halachic weight. Like peace between people, married, not married, in general, less anger, all of that stuff. Like we talk about it as if it's like secondary. I don't think it's secondary, and I don't see in the halachic literature that it's secondary.
right. The
hmm
poskim, talk about havat sham ben shalom ben adam lachaviro as like
Like
part
that's how
of,
you're getting a place in this world and the world to come for that.
and so we then had to set this couple up with a certain poskim to talk about their nesting arrangement, because the mediator they decided they wanted to do one of these sort of nesting arrangements where the kids stay in one home, so it'll be more stable for the kids, and the parents swap which home it's in, and it happens to be there are grandparents for each side that live nearby, so it's easy for the people to then have a room with their parents. Not that that's ideal, and it works, financially and for the kid, and it's actually become a functional system. There are halachic concerns related to yichud and other things in those sorts of situations that need to be dealt with a sensitive posek who's sensitive to what they're trying to do writ large, but also the technical violations. So I guess my question for you, saying custody, what should happen? Divorce is hard on kids. I think there's no two ways around it, and it's hard on parents. But in an ideal world, both parents should be afforded, meaningful involvement in both the physical and legal custody of their children, right? That they should,
Well,
uh,
I'm going a step
and
before that.
oh
I'm
yeah,
saying before they even talk about a custody agreement, they come before you and they say, the wife says, I'd like a divorce. The husband says, well, I didn't ask for this. And I love my children. I want to see my children every single day. I'm like, I don't want to, he's confused. There's nothing really more for him to say. It's just, I've done everything I could for this marriage. from what I understand, he would be asked to finalize the divorce with a get at that point. And then what? Like, is that what you would do, or am I just assuming that? Like, what
Yeah.
happens?
Oh, so yeah. So right, I see. So I think it's important to say at the outset, right, the principle that undergirds that, and we talk about the procedure, and that is that of Ma'asalai, that in, rabbinic literature, if one party to a divorce, either party, no longer wants to, now that's not, I'm not talking about the get, I'm talking about can we get divorced, right? What the get given willingly and voluntarily is a different issue. But if a party wants to get divorced, even not for a reason that is kind of where we would obligate a divorce, but just a party wants to get divorced because they are no longer into the marriage for whatever reason, not through any fault, that we fell out of love. I I fell in love with someone else. I don't know, whatever, right? The things that happen to people, or I'm just not feeling it anymore, or in a recent case we have, our lifestyles just don't mesh well. We get along, but like this is a mess for us. We're not our best selves together. We'd be better off separate. So if one person feels that way, but the other person doesn't, the halacha is that a divorce is still eventually what is going to happen because, as the Rambam states, women in this case are not kishvuyot, are not captives, and they don't have to stay if they don't want to. That's true for men as well. The Rambam just needed to state it because it's harder for women to get a divorce. So all of the process is kind of going to go based on the presumption that people get autonomy and agency in deciding if they're out of a marriage. And we do often have to deal with, and I think this is important, people that feel aggrieved, men and women that feel aggrieved that this is happening, like an injustice has happened. They did nothing wrong. It's now going to have negative financial consequences, negative consequences for their children, negative consequences on them. It is painful. And I think this is where there is a real pastoral job to be done, right? One of the things we pride ourselves on is having a team of social workers and clergy who will meet with people, talk it through, recommend resources. It's hard. It's not fair always. And it's not, I don't want to downplay that. That pain is sometimes the worst pain people will feel in their lives. So I don't know if that's what you're getting at, but it's very, very painful. I don't know. I cry regularly talking to people when they talk about just how painful this is, especially if one person doesn't want it. But in the end of the day, the policy is if one person doesn't want it, it's going to end. There can be couples therapy. Sometimes there's rehabilitation of marriages, shalom bayis. But usually, if one person wants out and they're coming to a Beit Din, they've tried whatever they're going to try, and we often see people kind of in denial that it's over. And at that point, the best step is to help them move past denial, which won't be constructive, towards trying to get, and actually maybe counterproductive, and move them towards, coming up with the best arrangement possible in a post-marriage world. That's before the process. But I just want to talk about kind of like higher order theory.
Yeah, and I think it might be helpful to like ground this in some text. So here's how Rav Henkin it talks about this. He says, Im hishtadlu la'asot shalom, they really tried to make peace between them. V'lo ho'il, and it didn't work, and one of them still wants to get divorced, or both of them still want to get divorced. Avru yud bet chodesh, and a year has passed. Mitzvah alav legarsha. It is he has to do a divorce. It doesn't matter. And then he puts in a parenthetical. He quotes the Rambam that Rabbi Dolinger just quoted. De'in benot Yisrael kishvuyot lahabal lisnolahan. Daughters of Israel are not hostages to their husbands, especially if they don't love their husbands anymore. And he says also, like in this world, in this country, Vidora Zeb Hazot. That if you withhold Gittin, there are real consequences to holding up a divorce, that people end up becoming adulterous or things like that. Chas v'shalom, it's terrible. And the most important thing then is to move along with a halachic divorce, despite the hardship and the pain of it.
Right.
Now,
So
in our cases, we do see kind of two types of shalom bias claims, I will say. Right. One is a good faith claim from someone that I think our marriage still has a chance. And sometimes the other party's not sure, right? Sometimes that's like one sort of claim. And then we see the type of shalom bias claim where someone's living with another person already. They have moved on, but they say, I'm claiming shalom bias. And they'll say it in that language. I'm claiming, it's like a legal card. they play in order to try and delay proceedings for various reasons. So those are very different, and they it's really a shame that people misuse, this idea that we could try to get back together as like a legal get out of jail card or delay the system card when they're engaged in extortion versus, some people really say, wait, please, let's give it another shot, or can I do something different, or can we go to therapy, right? Those are different things. We see both of those. So I just wanted to, and they're
Right.
different. And the final thing I'll say about this is if there's been abuse, very serious abuse, or sometimes like a 5-year restraining order. We had a case where there was a 5-year restraining order because the person was shot and the other person said shalom bias, and I had to tell this man,
Like, some point you can't
sorry,
come back
but
from it. You
when
shot your
pulled the-
spouse. Like, your
when
shalom
you
bias
pulled the
claims are
trigger,
over.
right? When you pulled the trigger, but that's different than the guy who says, wait, I know I've been working too many hours, and but I'm doing it for our family, and our intimacy has suffered. But can we try? Right? That was the case too, right? And he felt like his sacrifice for the family and working a second job caused the loss of intimacy that caused his spouse to want to get divorced, and he felt. I think it's important to be in the specifics about what it's like for people, right? There was a loss of intimacy. Everyone agreed that the spark was no longer there, but he felt it's because he's been working so hard to support the family, which is a venerable thing to do. And that feels tragic. And
Right.
so
But
those
who's
are
the
different
judge?
situations.
Who's the judge of that? If he says, I've been working so hard, that's the reason. It would seem to me that, well, it's not really up to him. It's it's the spouse's decision. And if the spouse still wants out, then he or she should be entitled to leave the marriage. That seems pretty reasonable and clear. But my question was, if one spouse wants to leave the marriage, for that example, the other spouse is just working so hard, they're never home, and says, look, I want to leave the marriage. The other spouse says, no, let's try. She says no, or he says no. Then my question is, why does the other spouse lose their children from a halachic perspective? Meaning, from a halachic perspective, what is the basis to say that if one spouse wants to leave, which I would agree, I think most listeners would agree that if you want to leave a marriage, I think what the Rambam says also is that a Jewish woman is not a captive. I don't think the Rambam says that she could also leave with the children and with money. I think he says that she can just go and she shouldn't be held captive in the home, and she should be allowed to be released. But I don't think, I'm pretty sure the Rambam also says that if she's in love with someone else, as you mentioned, I think that's actually a disqualifier. That would disqualify her claim, because the Beit Din could verify that's not actually what's going on. So it happens to a lot of men. A lot of men just suddenly can have very limited access to their children because they were working too hard. There was a loss of intimacy or whatever it was. From your Beit Din perspective, how is that justified, and what do you say to a couple that comes in like that and says, I don't want to finalize the divorce yet because halachically there are issues with my access to my children?
Oh, so
I'm not so clear on what you're saying about that, like, halachic access to children thing. Like, the halachot there are very complicated. It depends on the age of the children. The financial requirements of the father are not the same as, like, what we would today term custody. There's a lot of halachic literature saying in general that small children are better off, boys and girls are better off with their moms. Like, I think it's a lot more complicated than what you're laying out here.
Right. So let me go back a step and say, like, a couple gets married and they have a child. Whose child is that? Is it one of theirs? Is it both of theirs? Who does the child belong to?
So the child, right? So, and this is the thing, right? There's the halachic sources, and then there's the application of halakha in modern context in modern law, and that's a real halachic thing, right? We don't just do the Talmudic system in a modern state with modern arrangements, because I think everyone would agree that it wouldn't exactly match our modern arrangements of living. But the classic halachot tend to prioritize the father paying for the chinuch of the children, or paying for things, right? And the mother caring for children, as one would expect, right? Those are more or less. And as the kid gets older,
and by the way, that same arrangement plays out when they're married also, right? That the father has like a chiyuv and mizonot and certain things towards the children, and the mother has these caretaking obligations.
But from a basic halachic perspective, the main sources note that both parents have, some, rights is a little foreign to the halachic discourse.
Yeah,
but
I was gonna say it's obligations it's like the language is apotropos, like it's
obligations and care and support,
Yeah.
right? It's an interesting thing. But the sources also note that if one steals or kidnaps a kid from another parent, it's very, very painful. I mean, I think we're touching on what people call parental alienation, right? And it's a big topic And I think it's really being explored very, I know I just went to a continuing legal education on it, a whole day seminar last week. And, there's a lot of debates, research, ongoing research, discourse. It's like, but it's an important thing because people know they're experiencing, right, the alienation from their children, sometimes by the other party's manipulation, and or sometimes both. And in halacha, everyone has obligations to care for the children, and everyone has rights to the extent that that language is used, or at least the pain of having children removed from them is considered. There's just not really a better way, unfortunately. Like you can't live in the same house still. Right? In halacha, you can't say we're getting divorced, but we'd still like to live as roommates, perhaps with our new partners. And I could imagine some situation. I'm sure some folks live in this arrangement where they live as roommates in order to do it best for the children. In halakha, there's an isser v'yichud, and when you're divorced, you have to leave the house for other considerations, right? And so, unfortunately, there's just not a better way. But hopefully, engaged, loving fathers and engaged, loving mothers will both have meaningful and maximal access to their children. That's the goal, is to give parents meaningful access for the benefit of them and the benefit of their children.
The question is, why would a child and a parent, why should they not have 100% access to each other?
Because of the Isser Yichud. That's the real kicker in halacha. Meaning,
No.
otherwise, you would say, everyone, you're divorced, but you're living together, or you're in
No,
and out of the house,
before they get,
whatever.
I'm talking about before they get divorced. There's a father and mother, and they have children, and both parents want to have 100% access to their children, and the children want to have 100% access to the parents. And now one of the parties wants to get divorced. But why should that change anything about what the children have access to and what the other parent has access to? What's the basis? I'm just asking, what is what changed? I understand one of the parents now wants to get divorced, but what does the other parent have to do with that? Why do they now lose 100% access to their children? What's the trigger? What actually is
it's not really a loss. I think it is a loss in real terms, but the halakha is dealing with the pragmatic, as is the civil law, right? Which is, if there's no arrangement, what's the alternative? No arrangement. So then you just have chaos. In other words, since the parents are not living together, so it can't be that both parents will always have the kids.
Well, they are living together. Well, one of the parents wants to leave because she fell in love, or he fell in love with someone else. So they are living together, but one of the parents has changed their mind, or has
But you're
fallen
allowed
out
to
of
do
love.
that. In Judaism, you're allowed to fall out of love. You're allowed to move on. And that's not going to change the basic fact of Tovat Hayeled, what's best for the kid. And what's best for the kid is presumptively, if it's safe and good, to have, relatively equal or significant access to live with sometime with both parents. And, that's just, there's no penalization in Jewish law for being the person that decides you want out. You don't therefore then, that's not viewed as something that, oh, you want out, so when
So
we
you lose
divide it up,
access to the
you lose,
kids.
because it's
Because it's
the
bad for
halak,
the kids. It's bad for the
right?
kids.
Tovat hayeled, it's better for the kid, even though it is painful. I'm not saying it's not
Well,
painful to people.
I mean, someone would say, well, isn't it bad for the kids to have an affair and leave, run off with someone else? Isn't that bad for the
It's
kids?
worse for the kids to lose access to a parent. We're not dealing with an ideal world. Ideal world, two people get married, they have children, they live together until they're 119, and they die in each other's arms. That's not the world we're talking about.
So then, I would go back a step and say, this is a legal concept. Are you familiar with the concept of a totality of the tenancy?
Yeah, I mean, I'm an attorney, so
I mean, just to explain for the listener, that was the idea that, I think it still is the idea that if a couple is married and let's say they own a house, neither side could sell the house, and the court can't even order the sale of the house while the couple is living in it, because they both own 100% of the house. And
yeah,
the
it's called
idea,
that tenancy by the entirety.
oh,
Exactly.
sorry, that's what it was. Tenancy by the
Yeah,
entirety. I thought it was-
The totality, entirety
Thank
of
you,
this,
Rabbi.
the technical.
So the idea is that as long as you're married, you own the house together, and even if the other spouse says, I'm selling half of my share of the house, they can't, because I live in the house and I'm the other spouse, and then I'll have no place to live. So they each have 100% of it, and the idea is that it protects both spouses from any major disruption in their lives, and it protects their rights as a married unit. So I think that like halachically, that's sort of the idea is that a couple's married, there's an entirety, and the children are part of the entirety of the marriage. And if one party wants to leave that marriage, so in the case of the house, if one party wants to leave the house, that would not obligate the other party to now sell half of the house or sell the whole house because, otherwise, what would be the point of being married? I'll make that the question. Like from your perspective, or from the business perspective, what rights do you have as a married couple? What rights and or
You don't have any
responsibilities?
rights. Yeah, I was gonna say Judaism doesn't have rights.
Like Tovat Hayeled is the guide in the North Star, right? And I know that is ambiguous, but what's best for the child, but that the analysis is really a child-centered analysis with an understanding that this will be painful for parents, right? The sources are clear in mentioning that. I'm not, but ultimately it's about what's best for the welfare of the children. And I think the research is pretty extensive that what's best for the children is to have both parents in their lives, and there's just no way to the truth is, even if in the United States, the Beit Din would try and make rulings that, veered from kind of best interest standards, those rulings would get challenged,
At
in the
great expense, by the way.
yeah, but I think even if there wasn't a civil system, I'd say the same thing. So I don't want to lean on the civil system as an excuse.
Wait, but you like we have Piskei Din coming out of Israel where they're also like it's exactly your question of like who gets to decide what's the best for the children, which is obviously really interesting and really complicated. And we have Piskei Din coming out of Israel that sort of admit like most Batei Din do not have the capability to like go into people's homes and do the type of inspection that civil servant that governments can do. And so here I'm reading a case that came out of Netanya in 2007. They say, "Ein safek shebenoseh zeh shel mishmoret ve'asderei re'iyah shel ktinim ein biyacholotan shel Beit Din o Beit HaMishpat levarer hamatzav," right? That a Beit Din doesn't, and they say also a court generally don't have the capabilities to fully understand the situation of the children and the family and what's best for the kids. Right? Therefore, the Beit Din basically appoints the people who work for the welfare administration. I don't know what that would be in America, to do the types of investigations of what's in the best interest of the children. And then the Beit Din says, like, yeah, they're working for us, and we're gonna make our judicial decisions about Tovat Hayaled based on their recommendations.
But what I will say is when there are disputes about that, right? People will hire advocates. We've seen this in our cases or in cases in other Beit Din we've been involved. People will hire advocates. So one side will have a psychologist, another side will have a psychologist. They'll issue a report. They'll issue competing reports, and we'll hear it out. And we'll try and consult experts like and a wide variety of opinions. I think we try and keep an open mind when these things are there and to try and determine what is best. But we need to lean on experts, and ultimately it's also flawed. Any Beit Din that's going to issue decisions on this, there are going to be some that are not perfect. They didn't get right.
Mm-hmm.
But that's why also both in a Beit Din system and in American law, custody can be reevaluated.
Right. Mm-hmm. But the halacha is tovat hayaled, so even in like the Rambam, like that's the classic development of halacha is going to look more or less. It might look a little more sort of father money, mother childcare in a classic medieval rabbinic ruling. But today, the poskim, whether of all stripes, are going to be issuing rulings that approximate more or less what you'll see in civil courts. Mm. It's better in a Beit Din usually, but
yeah, probably. So just to go back on that topic, I want to come from another angle. There was a scholar named Rabbeinu Gershom. He made some very important halachic updates. One of them was that a woman cannot be forcibly divorced. Prior to that, a husband could just stuff a get in his wife's hands, or he could trick her into taking it, and she would be divorced.
He'd have to leave her ketubah also.
Oh, right. He would have to pay her a nice amount of money. And Rabbeinu Gershom said, nope, not happening anymore. We are not allowing that. Halachically, a woman cannot be forcibly divorced. So my question would be, what is your view? What is your opinion about this halacha?
I think that was like always what the Torah intended, and it became kind of like almost an opening that was ripe for abuse, and so Rabbeinu Gershom or Agola just closed the opening that people were walking through to abuse. But and people just slightly later than Rabbeinu Gershom, so the Rosh and others really spell out. He says that the intention was equality, and the Torah doesn't want people to injure each other, abuse each other, hurt each other, throw each other out like trash. That's not the intention of the Torah. When the Torah gives a mitzvah of divorce, it's because the marriage is over, and now there's a mitzvah from the Torah to write a get and give it to her, and for her to, and Rabbeinu Gershom for her now to receive it. But it was always meant to be respectful. And when it became not respectful in a certain direction, Rabbeinu Gershom closed the loop.
Yeah, but why would Rabbeinu Gershom say that a woman, isn't he enabling get refusal by women? Why would he do that? Shouldn't she just accept it? What was the purpose? What was he getting at?
Yeah, so I think I'm not an expert on the history, but to the extent that we've consulted experts at the time, there were a lot of men, I believe. This is at least what I've come to understand, who were traveling on business and would stay, for an extended time abroad. And
the person to read on this, by the way, is Avraham Grossman, Pious and Rebellious. Yeah,
right. So
the scholar.
Tell me if I'm, misstating the history, but the men were away, and there'd be other women,
and they tried to address it in other ways. Like, you have always taken over that time. How long is a man allowed to be away on business? Things like that.
And so this was really a kind of disincentive for men he was looking at trying to keep marriages together by disincentivizing infidelity on long business trips. One of the things you see about the post-game throughout, whether it's Rabbeinu Gershom with that takana, or modern, like Rav Henkin that Rabbanit Sarna read, where he says you need to give the get right away because otherwise it will lead to Giloy Arayos, women will have adulterous affairs, is that the post-game are aware that people are going to want to have sex, and they work with the policy, right? They're not interested in kind of moralizing and telling men or women, right, like bad, right? You could have different versions of either of them, where Rabbeinu Gershom is just yelling about men engaged in affairs with, presumably non-Jewish women on their extended business trips.
Well, he does that, right? Because that's the other takana.
Right. He does that, but
the other takana is monogamy for Jewish men.
And you could have Rav Henkin telling women instead, you must not, but instead what you see is the rabbi saying, look, people are people. We understand people are people. Let's create incentives in the system to minimize halachic violation, right? So that's really what I think Rabbeinu Gershom's interest, you've got to imagine, right? The height of piety is really to try and protect Jewish marriage and the institution of Jewish marriage. That's what he's looking at. And I think that's what Rav Henkin.
And to create systems where people treat each other well. That's the goal. And the goal, right? In an ideal world, you would never need any laws, right? Because people would just be perfect and they would treat each other kindly all the time. You only need law once you have exactly what you said before, two people. That's where you need law, right? Otherwise, if they just said, oh, wow, look at this nice talit I found, let's cut it in half and we'll all walk on our way, then you don't need a Beit Din at all. Perfect,
Do you think that nowadays, in light of the takana of Rabbeinu Gershom, do you think it still applies, or do you think women should be possible to forcibly divorce a wife?
So here's what I'll say. I think people or conflate often a kind of voluntary nature of divorce with halachic obligation, right? So the rabbis can obligate a man to give a get, and it's a mitzvah. It's a biblical mitzvah. It's a requirement. Not doing it is a violation of a mitzvah, right? It's not like back to our kind of rights thing. I think a lot of people think this is my right. We could make it both sides for the moment. Men, I think it's usually a claim more by men, but this is my right to to give the get, and I'm going to not use my right because I feel I was wronged in this area. The custody decision wasn't correct, and I have this right. I'm going to use my right. Or the other side, women will say, I don't like this or whatever, and I'm not going to accept it. Everyone has to engage in a voluntary, non-coercive action, and that's important. People need to agree to what they're doing, and Rabbeinu Gershom was making women creating a takana where women would also have to engage in a voluntary, willful action, not against their will. just as men have to voluntarily give the get. When they give a get, there's a bittul modaos and the language of the Aruch HaShulchan also, which adds, men have to say, I'm doing this of my free will, even if a lot of consternation went into it. But at that moment, it has to be an act of free will that is acknowledged and stated. And that is different than saying people, it's totally their right, free will. They have to give it a free will. It's my right to not give or to not accept this get. In halacha, if a Beis Din says you are obligated to give this get, you are obligated to accept this get, as Rav Moshe and Rav Henkin both write about extensively, then they have to do it. And there are communal consequences, debating which one, brought to bear for not following it. So an obligation is different than the requirement that it needs to be voluntary. So when you ask, should a woman be forced to accept a get, I would say it's the same answer for men and women. If a rabbinic court of competence has decided that a get is obligated, then they should use all lawful, normative rabbinic power to force the man or the woman to give or receive the get. I don't know if that answers the question,
Right.
but yeah.
No, so I would go back to just focusing on cases that are not, where there's no obligation, where she's not a moredes or something of that status. She's just a good wife. And the husband, she even moved across the country for the husband so that he could pursue a career. She did everything. She was a great wife. She cooks, she cleans, she works, she takes the kids to school. She's a great mother. But the husband is, having an affair with the secretary, and he wants to pursue that. And there's no hard feelings. He just wants to get divorced from her. And he wants to just place a bill of divorce in her hands. And he's trying to find a way to do it because she's not accepting it. There's no halachic trigger for a Beit Din to say she's obligated to take it. But what would a ruling in a case like that, obviously all things considered, how would you look at a case like that? Does she have a right to say, we're married and that's the agreement we made when we stood under the chuppah, and that's the agreement. I'm standing by that agreement. What would you say?
I think I'm probably going to maybe surprise your listeners, but I think we would say the same thing we would say for a man in that case, were this scenario reversed, which
the marriage is over. The marriage is over.
Right. Once the marriage, and this is the Rav Henkin, Rav Moshe standard, and maybe actually for your listeners, this is our main shita that I think is really important for people to know. Rabbeinu Yerucham had a theory. It's one of the Rishonim that the Kaf HaChaim, Rav Chaim Falaji, people know him as the Kaf HaChaim, major Kabbalist and halakhic authority, made popular, which has been widely adopted by the poskim in Israel, the major poskim manenu, the leaders of our time, and Rav Moshe and Rav Henkin, that were collectively responsible in their own rights for advising the Beit Din in America, that if a marriage is over, and they quantified it, if after 12 months it's clear shalom bayis isn't happening, or 18 months, they have a little difference. They had a time quantifier on that. But the truth is, even short of that time, if it's clear the marriage is over and the husband says, look, we had this case with the husband and the secretary, and we had your case where the wife was refusing to accept the get because the husband had an affair with the secretary. So let's, it's not a fictitious example. It is a real case we had. And the husband said, look, I'm sorry. I feel bad that it happened this way, but now I love her. And life sucks. Sorry. And they didn't have kids, so it was a little better. But what we told her was, look, halacha is, unfortunately, that for you, that your marriage is over. And I know you feel like he cheated on you, and he did, and he admits and he feels bad. And now you've got to move on, and you have to accept the get. She refused to accept the get, and so we helped him deposit the get as per what Rav Moshe says, and gave him a heter to remarry. He's now happily remarried. That's the halacha, is that right or wrong, if the marriage is over, the marriage is over.
Right.
And people.
One thing about just depositing the get, because some people mean different things by that. So when we say deposit the get, that means she can come get it for free anytime, no conditions, no anything, right? It's just there waiting for her. She doesn't have to pay up. She doesn't have to go to court to file. She doesn't have to anything. Let's just be clear about what the standard is for that.
So, but on that, what stands out, and I think I heard something like this, Rabbanit Sarna, on your previous podcast, that made me. I wish that Francisco would have asked, but it was a very broad podcast, which was that once the marriage is over, it's over. But the obvious thing is. I agree with you. But the big question is a marriage is over as soon as one party declares that it's over. That's the fact. One party says it's over, it's over. But the question really is though, when a couple is married, right? There's a difference between being in a long-term relationship and marriage, at least in my view. So I'm wondering, in your view, what happens when a couple, because there's a commitment. We like to say, a woman will say, "I want him to commit to me with marriage." What exactly is that commitment? If he could just cheat and then he can just move on, new wife, take the kids, take half the assets, keep that. What actually is the commitment that took place with the marriage? I'm just wondering what you see as the
I like
commitment.
that you said it so casually. Oh, he can just cheat. Like, that's the violation of the commitment.
Well, that's what I'm asking. So what was the commitment? Because what
The
did he
commitment
commit
is
to?
not to do that.
But
Right.
he did, and he can easily do it, and there's no consequence. So what is the real commitment?
The consequence is that his marriage is over now.
Right, but he doesn't care because he cheated. So what's the
He
practical?
should
What rights
care.
does she
He should
have?
care.
Well,
Klapi Shemaya also, we do, but like, here's our thing, right? We do believe in reward and punishment. And it's one of it's one of the Ikarim. And like for religious people, and this is one of the problems in the divorce thing. Even religious people, and I think actually it's a communal issue. I'm not blaming individuals. I'm not a fan of blaming individuals when systems encourage them into situations that are not ideal. We treat this as if somehow our religious community is no longer firm or religious when it comes to divorce, and everyone can just what's the consequence if people violate Shabbos, or if people eat pork, or if people cheat or steal or rob and don't get caught, if they cheat on their taxes, if they rob their neighbor blind, or whatever, right? And so there are the consequences they will inflict on their own moral character, or the natural sequela that will come from those things. But there's also, just and loving God who in the afterlife has some fire and brimstone to show them for,
sure.
morally bad behavior. I don't want to
With
go
a
crazy here.
possibility of tshuva between now and then.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
No, it's all good. But I'm saying, like we're a religious community, and so like the same mechanisms we use, right, carrots and sticks to encourage people's moral and upright behavior amidst the many temptations of olam hazeh, of this material world, is it's not different in divorce. We want to be encouraging people to act according to their better angels, and if they've sinned, to do teshuvah, right? Like if someone has done that, and I would say actually that's part of our role as a Beit Din, right? To that man, we did say, you might want to consider, and we'd be happy to help you craft an apology because he felt guilty, right? Like people are real people. He felt bad that he cheated on his spouse in this example. And a lot of our conversations were about not the get or her refusal, were about his own guilt. Right. Now he didn't want to go back to his marriage, and he wasn't going to, and he was going to move on with the new, but he felt really bad about it. And that's good. People should feel bad when they do that. It doesn't mean he shouldn't do what's best for him in the rest of his life. But we did work with him on, what would it look like to try and have a process of teshuvah or apology. She wasn't open to it in that case, so it didn't really matter. She wasn't going to speak with him or whatever. But I think that's where like the religion comes in, right? It's not all wheeling and dealing.
Well,
It is
that's
still.
between, I understand that between man and God, but so are you saying that like within a marriage, a man and his wife to husband, they don't have any worldly commitments to each other? If they fail in their marriage, it's just something that they'll deal with at the pearly gates? Or should there be like a real consequence if someone doesn't uphold their side of the marriage?
Yeah, so look, if there is like clear fault in a divorce, right, usually the ways those are accommodated in civil legal regimes, and I would say halacha rightly applied has adopted similar mechanisms, is to look at length of marriage, fault and dissolution of marriage, and other things in modifying from a kind of 50-50 line support, right? So money is often the way these things get settled, right? And to say, okay, you would have in an ideal world gotten 50-50 based on, these 17 factors, right? Every state is a slightly different regime, but how long you were married, who sacrificed what for the marriage, who needs what, the lifestyle of the parties, what you brought into it, all that jazz, right? So to then say, okay, and this person was super loyal and at home with the kids while you were off having an affair with your secretary. So this asset division, instead of 50-50, it's going to look a little more like 55-45. That's a way that some jurisdictions, not all, for many adultery, in this example I'm using, for many states, adultery is no longer considered a factor in doing that. I
Is that, what do you
personally
think about
would say
that?
I think that's a bad thing. It's a sign of moral decay in society, but that's me being a little bit of a like religious
That's not wearing your
conservative.
lawyer hat. Yeah.
Yeah, like as a lawyer, it is what it is. But as a like religious individual, I think that, the fact that we've just casually accepted that and it's no longer even considered a thing, but other things are considered a thing is a bad development. But I'm not going to change, societal attitudes towards that on my
Right.
own.
No,
But
yeah.
yeah,
No, the reason I get to that is because I think it's important because in the American system, it used to be that if you cheated, I think there would be a penalty because you broke the marriage, you broke your commitment, and halacha didn't change. So there still is the concept of you made a contract, you made a covenant, and if someone breaks it, it's not just like the American system where you still there's no actual consequence, right? It's completely ignored. Everything's treated the same. So it just seems strange that a Beit Din would adopt that, even though halacha hasn't changed. I mean, halacha, it goes with the times, but it doesn't fundamentally change.
so,
And
so financial
Mhm.
halacha, this is what I'll say. This is so one. I could see, we have seen Beit Din that would still, slightly. No one's doing major adjustments, but would give someone a little more, a little less based on fault, and might incorporate a version of fault that isn't equivalent to the secular state's version of fault. I say three things. That's one. Two is halakha does on the financial end, the mechanism in the poskim by which this changes is minhag, right? And there's a wide-ranging assumption that for all the cases we're dealing with, people's financial affairs and their assumptions about marriage and its dissolution are not halachic assumptions. They're assumptions about the way society runs. And that's why all of the poskim say in a world of marital partnership, people are kind of organizing their affairs in the way the state and society suggest they will. And
But that
the
organization carries halachic weight as minhag, as umdana. Like it's not that, oh, it's completely separate. There's like a halachic way of being and a social way of being. The social way of being carries halachic heft.
the final thing I would say though is, often I think this is important to say in the cases we're dealing with. Again, we're dealing with like mainly cases of agunot. You get the kind of weaponization of fault in ways which is complicated for folks, right? So you get a false. No, this is not, I think, the case you're mainly interested, but I think it's important for people to know in our cases, dealing with cases of agunot, what we frequently see are, men who are openly living with other people, just doing basic projection and saying she's living with another man, even though like usually like I've had a case where a man will say that as a woman is in the background in his bed on the Zoom call, right? So it's like, okay, sir, like maybe,
and it's
but
not a
like,
virtual background.
no, right? It's not my farm. So like, but we see the kind of intentional weaponization of these sort of claims in an attempt to like isolate individuals, and we've seen it from women to men too, but we mainly see it in that direction.
I think it's also
Uh,
worth saying, like, how many of those cases are there? Because some, like, the stories you tell, and we haven't even like had story time here, I feel. We haven't cracked open that can of worms. But like the stories that our Beit Din sees, like it seems like they're so crazy that it must be like one every 5 years, you know? But actually, I mean, I'll let you say it, but
Yeah, I mean, like currently we're on pace to see about like 100 cases. It's important, but we're not seeing most divorces. Most divorces are not this, but we do see about 100 cases a year of, it may as well be some kind of true crime TV show with the level of often mental illness, trauma, and, violence and that is and control that is involved. We see people kind of chained in a basement for years, not coming out to see the light of day. And that's the kind of stuff we see twice a week,
Right.
every week.
Right. And
Now,
it's
it's
really
not.
important for people to know that that's not like, oh, it doesn't happen in the Jewish community, or like, oh, it's super crazy rare and you only see it on SVU. Like, this stuff happens in our community. We see it twice a week, every week. And so when we're talking about agunot, like, it's not like, oh, it's so far off, it's so different, it's so whatever. Like, this is real, it's live. People are really, really hurting and hurting each other in ways that are usher.
So, right. So one of the things we're on the lookout for is kind of like good faith, right? Trying to distinguish, and I would encourage people to do this, to distinguish between kind of good faith claims of who is at fault versus, right, when people are manipulative, they're usually like pretty charming, often kind of narcissistic, and able to convince the public that the person X or Y is at fault. And so it's very important to investigate the claim and really make sure that it's not just being a kind of weaponized charge loudly proclaimed by a well-connected, charming, articulate, lovable individual to manipulate someone. But it is also important that if people, you're right, if people have engaged in fault, that will factor into the asset division, and it should. And if that the kinds of faults they've engaged in are things that do endanger the welfare of children or either party, that A, they be given the help they need. But we deal with a lot of addiction issues and other things too, right? Then often marriages fall apart in that way, or those things become coping mechanisms, or both. And so it's important to get people the help they need. I think that's important also. When dealing with fault, a lot of things that are fault are actually people struggling with addiction or difficulties or trauma. So it's like a combination of rearranging things a little, but also protecting individuals, men from women, women from men if there's danger, and children, but also trying to connect people. That's like why we love our social workers, right? And to get people of either side like the help they need to deal with the things that sometimes result in or are causes of the dissolution of a marriage.
Okay. I guess we have to end there. We covered a lot. There's still even more that I would love to cover, but definitely appreciate all the insight. I think it was really interesting, and got some insight onto how the Beit Din works and just how complicated. There's so many types of cases, there's so many factors, and there's so many different views on what marriage is and how its place in the modern world, how it interacts with what we think of as halacha and American law together. I really appreciate all the time, and I'll put your info up of the International Beit Din if anybody needs consultation. I think they'll be able to reach you. As you said, you help men and women in both cases. If a spouse is,
And
not.
we'll also like mediate a whole divorce, meaning a couple wants an amicable divorce, we can help with that too. It's the case that we often end up with the hardest cases, but you're an easy case, we want to help you also.
Yeah, we love the easy cases.
It's like a palate cleanser, you know?
And we're just looking for someone to help us figure out how to divide these things, but we have no fighting. Like, we got one of those this year, and I'm like, yes. I want to thank you for providing such a thoughtful forum. I think it's really important for these issues to be discussed candidly, in detail, openly, and I really appreciate the forum you've provided for your listeners to do that.
Wow.
Yeah,
Thank
I
you
was
so
so
much.
honored when you reached out, seriously.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. And I really respect the openness, and we really exploit stuff that, it's controversial, and I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Let's Get Serious podcast. Please like, subscribe, and share this podcast with your friends and family. Help us reach more men in our community and help them navigate their relationships and build the best lives for themselves and loved ones.
Piada.